Welcome, everyone, to Women on Wealth. This is Jelena Ogilvy, and I think we have a really special episode here. The title of it is Victim to Advocate. And to share their story, I have Karen Robbins with us today. Karen, before you get going, I just want to, first welcome you, but also thank you in advance for your vulnerability on this topic. I know when you and I met and you were sharing your story, it's there's a lot of emotion wrapped around this. So thank you for sharing it today.
Thanks for having me.
So, before we get going, I wanted to, just to let everyone know that, you are a professional and you're here local in Connecticut. I know you're going to talk about that as you kind of weave into the story, but first, can you share a bit about what your background is and, what led you to become an advocate in financial abuse victims?
Okay. After college, went straight to law school. I ended up teaching paralegals for a few years. I liked that better than my summer practicing law at that point in time. And then I would say, actually, right after law school, I got married. So I taught paralegals for about 2 years, and then I stayed home for 18. So I paid my bar dues every year, which was a reduced amount because I was officially making $0 practicing law at that point. And then I was looking to go back to work, didn't know when that was going to be, how it was going to be, but hadn't really figured it out at the time that kind of everything shifted, which is why I'm here to talk to you
Talk a little bit about the shift.
about the shift. Well, it was right before COVID, or about 6 or 8 months before COVID. And some strange things were happening. I would say up until that point, I had, a few credit cards in my wallet. They were actually minus the store cards. They were my husband's cards, but they were our cards. We were married from the age of 25. He, had his own business, but he had done consulting prior to that. And somewhere along the line, he kind of took over the finances. I had known him since we were 14. I had many friends who one person in their marriage was in charge of their finances and would pay the bills and I think that's true of a lot of marriages.
Absolutely. Very common.
It's you can't sit down. It's all in theory nice and romantic. Maybe not so, but when you first get married or you first live together, you're going to sit down and you'll pay your bills together, and then life gets busy and it's redundant, and someone's better at it. So I had passed off bill paying control, so to speak, to my husband. Through the years, I had asked to see, I'm like, what if something happens to you? I'm a smart person, I'm an educated person, and I don't know the first thing about, which bill you're paying how, through what account. And so it was around those 6 months before that I really started pushing, where's the folder? Where is the folder? Oh, it's at my office in the drawer. Great. Can I see and make sure everything is in one place, should something happen?
And
Uh,
Karen, you're asking not because you at this point had no trust in him. You just wanted to know you just wanted to know there was a plan.
right. It was just this, I think someone had lost their neighbor, and it was not, and the woman was not a generation above us and was a smart person and was just all up in arms because she didn't know the first thing. And I was like, all right, I just want to know that if something happens, I know where everything is. It's just, a little bit of practicality. And I got a lot of pushback. And he was really good at smoothing it over and lying. And we went as far eventually when he showed me things as photoshopping things. Um,
Like photoshopping statements.
photoshopping statements, photoshopping addresses on statements, names on statements, numbers on statements. Now, I did not see that many statements because if you see one or two and they're in line with what they have been for the last,
Right.
and so what was missing at that point was that those statements may have even, some of them were accurate, some of them weren't.
You had
Um,
no basis to go off of.
Nothing. And so that folder never surfaced, the folder with all the information. The house was supposed to be paid off because we had not a very large mortgage and we had been in the house since we were 27, right? So this was almost, if you have a 15 or 18-year mortgage, it should have been almost done. And I think everything, you'd get a phone call. You're like, all right, someone just called and there's some issue, right?
Wow.
There's an issue with the mortgage. Oh, that must be a mistake. And I really don't consider myself to be naive. Okay. There is the fear, especially when there's kids around, of conflict, of,
Yes.
of escalating conflict. The pushback was probably less than it could have been had I been totally alone. But I also had no reason to be suspicious, except it started to build.
Yeah. And how long did this build for you?
I would say less than 6 months.
Wow.
So it was, I mean, I really was in the dark.
But
this is
once you question one thing, it just kind of opens a can of worms. And you start.
it starts, you get this kind of uncomfortable feeling. You're like, well, something didn't seem right there, but there was a reason. And then something else would happen and you kind of take a step back, but you don't want to explore too much.
Sure.
And this was someone that right when we got married had put out 5 or 6 different envelopes for receipts and suggested that it would work really well if I divided the receipts from various purchases. I mean, at that point, I was working into the different envelopes, and I laughed at him and got rid of the envelopes. It's never
Wow.
happened, but that was in the era where things weren't online.
Yeah.
I think, that was really the big difference is you couldn't have things redirected to someone else's email. You couldn't have things redirected to a different mailing address without something coming in the mail saying, and I actually think to a certain extent now it's getting somewhat better. When you
Okay.
move, they are sending letters to both addresses with confirmation and two-factor authentication. But this started in 2002.
Okay.
I found out in 2020. So we had been married, got married in 97. So this started in 2002, where he started opening credit cards using my information in my name, bank accounts in my name with all my information. He forged my name, didn't even pretend to make it look anything other than his handwriting. The Bank Secrecy Act was in play, like they were supposed to know their clients.
Yeah.
Didn't seem to matter. So this went on, and it's almost always, I've since learned, this identity theft is more likely to happen to family members than to strangers. And I'm
Absolutely.
like, who would do this to their family? This must be the only time, I wanted to be really unique, I guess. I'm like, oh, this never happens. Like, who would do this to their family? And, it's
And yet it
certainly
happens all the
awful,
time.
but it does because they have access to the information. They know your social, they know your address, they know unless you're really creative, they know your secret questions,
Yes. Exactly. Wow.
right? So unless they're using, and I did have one recording where although it mysteriously disappeared, and from from a 529 plan, that they
Oh,
had him on the line saying he was me. And they had flagged something. And then I'm like, this is a deep man's voice. And you all can probably tell my voice is not super deep. And they're like, it's not our job to determine, the timbre of one's voice. Okay, but you're sending the deposits to someone else's address.
wow.
And I know a lot of the companies now do have, like, you can sign up for voice print
Activation
and all these things. But I mean, that piece of it wasn't that long ago. That was 2019.
and they send you a code or they send you a text. A code. Yeah.
Right. And that's actually the only reason I'm comfortable doing anything right now.
Mhm.
And it's not online versus not, but having that two-factor
Yeah. Authentication.
authentication or the voice match or anything like that.
That's unbelievable, Karen. And can you share more about the emotional aspect of what this had on you and your family?
Yeah. So it was actually my then, I think he was 20-year-old son who, right after the New Year, said, why don't you pull your credit report? Okay. So he's a sophomore in college during COVID, majoring in science, and is telling his lawyer educated mother to pull her credit report, which I should have thought about, but you just don't think because I had passed that off. Um, and no one ever said to me, you have this, what's this weird charge? But that would have just been my husband. So um, that night was a mess because it was my credit report that showed that there was more than $250,000 taken out, not including my house, in my name. And he had systematically increased my limits starting in 2002. Like he kept asking for increases. He was not in debt all that time. That had, and I don't even know that he was ever in debt versus just putting it in my name instead
Right.
of his, right? So he lives quite the lovely lifestyle and did. So I don't believe that was it because even when those were shut down. So emotionally, I mean, it's obviously one, it's a financial issue. You are just like, where do things stand? Who do I trust? And it's a trust issue because, as we said, it's whether it's your spouse or a lot of times right now, I practice in elder law in addition to trusts and estates. So it's a lot of protections for the elderly.
Which is so common as
And
well,
it's
unfortunately.
usually, yeah, it's their children who have all the information. And it's like how horrible to think that their children who are taking care of them or not even taking care of them.
That are
Some of this
taken.
happens before they even enter some type of cognitive decline where the children start racking up debt. They have access to the bank accounts, taking out money through power of attorney and not using it for their parents at all. And a lot of times, even if the parents find out, and I think elderly is considered over 60, which is, I like the protections helping anybody. The over 60, I think, is very different than the over 80, but I think it should definitely kick in whenever extra protections can kick in. But the same thing happens there.
Absolutely. And you don't have to be 60 to have a cognitive decline.
No, that's the other thing. And so, what does it really mean
Yeah,
from, if it's early onset, should 60 be the cutoff? Should it be based on age? And that's a whole different
yeah,
path to go down. But there is a lot of overlap and just the emotional turmoil. I mean, for everybody. And I think for me, a lot of it was protecting my kids, but I couldn't protect them. I mean,
they were
it just,
adults at this point.
yeah, well, I mean, my youngest at that point was 13,
Okay.
so
Oldest
that
was
they
20.
weren't, they were old. My oldest was 20. So, and there's one in the middle. So they were old enough to know what was going on. There was just no way to hide that things weren't good. You couldn't, school was up in the air, tuition was up in the air. I had no credit. I mean, I didn't even know
You had no
exactly.
credit and you had to start over again.
Yeah, well, the first thing I had to do was figure out what accounts actually had been opened in my name. And that
Yeah, so where do you
I
start
didn't have
there?
answers to any of the questions. They ask you, what email address did you use? Well, I don't know. I didn't use mine. It was his, and he had 10. I'm making up a number, or what phone number? I knew he had two or three cell phones, two work numbers, a home number. So I couldn't even get access. It took several months to even figure out what was out there.
Was
And it
he
was
using
never
his
good.
own email or was he creating emails under your name?
Both,
Both.
both. Yep. And opening things like PayPal accounts in his daughter's name and my name with different made up emails. And so
Oh my,
it took a very long time to gain access.
okay.
So even before you could starting over and realize, like, I wanted to be able to just start over at a base level, like clean,
Yes.
versus being responsible for digging out from, my house should have been paid off. It was pretty much, and it was only in my name, and there were forged signatures, and someone notarized and witnessed his signing of my name at a big bank. So, there are
On the
pieces
mortgage.
on the mortgage in the house that was in my name. The mortgage was in both names, the house was only in my name, and he took a large amount of money out. that way also. So that was my protection, and that was gone also. And I wanted to keep my kids in their house at that point because that was the stability. Oh, and it was COVID.
So where do you begin, Karen? How do you describe the process and what you went through?
The first thing is I worked off of the credit report.
Okay.
Um, and the credit report really shows you everything. Like any of my other credit cards that had been just in my name, even if I wasn't using them, because years ago, and you probably know this, they would give law students, college students really high, ridiculously high limits on credit cards. And I think I had one or two of those left in my name, not open, not with anything on them,
Right.
but they hadn't been shut down
Oh, yeah.
because they say maybe keep them open so you always have one in your own. Well, they had all been shut down, even say like my old Navy card for my kid. If it was only in my name, it got shut down because my credit rating had gone so low because of what he had done. So even the things he hadn't touched um, were shut.
Or shut down, where you were
Yeah,
affected completely by all of this.
yeah.
It,
So, and this was, and we're in a. I did not have a. Well, I did. I had a hidden stash of cash, but I that was gone because it wasn't that well hidden. Um, but regardless, at the time, I think we're also headed towards a cashless society for better or worse. And certainly during COVID, we were.
yeah.
And now there's, you can't really do much
Hmm.
without having credit, a credit score,
Absolutely.
a credit card, even with a small limit. I had one from my parents that I used, not necessarily, they're retired. It wasn't just, it wasn't going to pay tuition.
Yeah.
And then I ended up actually having this was a moment as my 20-year-old got me a credit card as an authorized user on his college credit card. And now they're much better. So I think they have like a $3,000 limit, not
Okay.
30,000. And when my son ever sent it to me in my name, that was
Wow.
very sweet, but very upsetting.
Very, yeah.
Yeah. And
Um,
so I spent just 2 years with banks
okay.
on phone calls. I had women, may I pray for you? I'm like, well, I'm not, I will take any prayers. That is wonderful. Thank you, whatever religion you are. I met the nicest people online, on phone calls, on things like that, but no one could help me.
No one can help you.
And I had people, and the different departments of the banks wouldn't talk to each other. They're not authorized to talk to each other. Yet at the same time, because it's your spouse or
Right.
your child, they still have your information. So you can put a freeze on your credit report, on your open credit. Not that I had any, no one was going to give me any.
Yeah.
But they would actually contact him, or he would write letters saying that from me. It was just ongoing. So you're
Yeah.
almost fighting yourself, if that
Yeah.
makes any sense.
Absolutely. And one of the reasons that Karen that I wanted to have you on was because there has been some recent legislation
Yes,
around this whole idea of coerced debt. Can you talk a little bit about what that is?
sure. Um, and I had absolutely no idea this term coerced debt, financial abuse, there's an overlap. They are not one and the same, but
Okay.
they often go together.
Go
I mean,
together. Yeah.
yes, absolutely. Coerced debt is a type of financial abuse. Uh, Coerced debt is any kind of debt that an abuser puts unwillingly in the name of their victim.
Like the credit cards.
Credit cards, bank accounts that they bounce,
Mhm.
loans secured on the house that they then spend and don't repay. And they're doing it intentionally. I mean, it overlaps also with ID theft. And there are statutes for ID theft. And this is kind of where I'm happy to be able to talk to your audience is the best statutes in the world don't do any good if they're not enforced. Okay, so the ID theft statutes were right there. You do X, Y, Z, and all those, and I could check all of them. And they're like, well, you were married. Or, oh, but it's your daughter. I mean, if in an elder
Sure. In an
abuse
elder care situation. Yeah.
situation, and do you really want to turn your daughter in? And so they bank on that. Um, so the ID theft statutes, I filed a police report. That was one of the first things I did.
Okay.
And this is where the legislation that got passed on protections against coerced debt, and it did take us a full 3 years and two votes, even when it had gotten out of committee. And I'm very thankful that concessions were made, to get as much of it passed as possible, even though some elements of it were gone. But overall, it did put a time frame on the banks.
Okay.
The coerced debt, it affects families, um, elderly. Um, it overlaps with human trafficking, all these horrible things,
Yes.
because access to funds and access to a decent credit rating affect whether you can get an apartment. Do you have housing? And I didn't have housing, because if you lose your house and you don't have a credit score, even if you have a job, which I didn't, but I eventually did, you can't get a lease. Doesn't matter how much you're making, they don't want to give you a lease, because that could end. And you can't lease a car. And forget getting a mortgage. And your insurance rates are higher. And I couldn't get life insurance, and it had nothing to do with my health. I was 48 years old, and I was considered risky because of the amount of debt I had.
Literally
None of which
started
was
over.
mine.
Yeah.
I had never carried a credit card payment past the month it was due.
And Karen, when you were talking about the legislation, you said it took us a few years. Can you talk about your involvement there?
For the actual bill that went through the banking committee of the Connecticut legislature,
Yeah.
I had started meeting remotely on Zoom with various representatives, uh, town of Simsbury, someone in Avon that I knew through my kid's school that's very active. So I'd have Zoom calls with 3 or 4 legislators at the same time, because no one seemed to have any idea this existed. And once again, these were very educated people. It wasn't that it's just, oh, well, if it wasn't you,
How
and you
could
can
this happen in Connecticut?
right. No, and that's the other thing. One of the reasons I really did push through and felt compelled to tell my story. And that's one of the things I said to my kids. And it's hard because I was not a social media user. I was very private. I was raised, don't talk about money, which was probably
Like so many
part
are.
of the issue. Not placing blame anywhere, but you don't talk about it. So if you don't talk about it, it's much easier to pass it off and not keep bringing it back up, because
And you don't know what's going on in the world around you when it comes to the financial side.
correct. And you're not going to have conversations with your friends about it. Like, hey, this is going on. What are your thoughts?
Mhm.
No matter how close you are, because, your parents' generation says women don't talk about money. Right. So unless you are working on Wall Street, and at that point, what was told to me is, if you are a woman, I mean, you can speak to this far better than I can, but if you are a woman, you're in a man's world. And so in theory, you can talk about it, but not over the dinner table. So if you're at work, that's fine, but that's where it's acceptable. And even if that's the case, then it stops in family social circles. Like, whereas,
Yes, very fair.
so
So, who do you think falls most victim to this coerced debt?
there's a statistic. It's actually really interesting, and nothing against Texas, but I think Connecticut, we think, or we'd like to believe, and comparatively, we'd like to say we're very progressive. We're on, I don't think Texas is known for protecting women's rights as a whole. And
Okay.
they have been on top of this. There's something
Oh,
called
interesting.
Appleseed. And
Appleseed.
Appleseed. And they started in 2019 in Texas passing financial protections for women,
Hmm.
which was just mind blowing to me. That Connecticut, they're like, we can't even go down this path because it's your spouse. And it's a he said, she said, no matter how many affidavits you've signed, no matter how clear as day the proof is.
Yeah.
And I have boxes of proof, of statements, of, I mean, so much didn't matter because we were married. And the fact that Texas, and they're still at it, they're still moving forward. I mean,
Okay.
Connecticut finally took a first step, a
Yeah.
very good one this year. We did pass a coerced debt protection bill.
Can you describe the bill a little bit?
The bill in Connecticut puts the big financial companies, and I would imagine small banks as well, but it puts them on a timeline
Mm.
so that they only have 60 days to do a full investigation. They
Okay.
I don't have it in front of me in terms of the details. As I said, it was changed many a time right up until the last minute to get it through this. I testified remotely the first year. The second year I testified in person and then was involved. It's back and forth with things being changed. But if you file a police report, if you sign an affidavit, if various things have occurred and those get sent, and I had done all of this like very early on, once I figured out to whom I needed to send it. And I had sent it certified tracked mail. I had all, now if you take those steps, there is a time frame and a specific set of policies whether there has been coerced debt. And during that time period, they cannot call your house with collection calls. They cannot bombard you with mail. I gave them my address. Keep in mind, they didn't have my address because everything had been switched electronically to a P.O. box, to his office address. So I gave the address my home address to some of the banks so they could contact me so that I could assist. And they used that against me and then said, well, we always had this address.
Okay.
So the things you had to, and this is with my, like, yes, I was emotional, okay, because it
Of
was my
course.
family, but I had a legal background and I was raised by a lawyer for an insurance company. So this was not out of my
Out of
like
your scope or
terminology. Yeah. And I think that's what was so mind blowing, which is why I'm still active. And it's why
yeah.
I did get over my fear or desire for privacy.
Yeah.
And I tried to tell my kids, you can't, it's your story to tell as you want or if you don't want. But that I had to take my own advice on that.
Yeah. I mean, so many in your situation never would have come as far as you have. So I think that that's tremendous,
And I think
tremendous
I
for all of
have,
the other women.
thank you. I think one of the things too is there's a safety risk for some women,
Yeah.
or for some older clients, however you want to look at it. I don't want to say that I was never afraid. I was definitely afraid. And when I filed for divorce, which obviously I did as soon as possible, if for no reason but to at least put a line and say, look,
Yeah.
I found this out and then I did this. But if you're not in a safe place, then you have to, at least physically, um, you have to be
Yeah.
aware of that as well. My kids, there really wasn't a custody issue. He took off somewhere living his life with all sorts of money. So he was not in the state, he was not reachable, he had different addresses. So from that standpoint, I think I was in a position to do a little bit more
Sure.
than others might be. But I was also thinking if I was this, I guess the words bamboozled would be kind of a word to describe it, with all of my education and friends in the industry, et
Yeah.
cetera, et cetera. And I could barely navigate it. And I mean, we'll just say, and I won't use any names, but last week, and it's been 4.5 years since I discovered it. Last week, I just finally got the last bank to go away. They were
1.5
from a lawsuit, even though everybody else,
Right.
the other
And
banks had dropped.
I dropped it.
Had dropped it. I mean, it's obviously like there's still mortgage payments that weren't paid. I didn't, but it eventually all got paid because I had to sell the house.
Yeah.
But this was the last, a very big bank that 3 very large credit cards were opened in my name. And despite the fact that I'd sent everything that all the other banks had cleared me of.
The longest.
It just got dropped and settled a week ago.
That is an incredible amount of time to be so.
And I have, yeah, and it just, so bouncing back,
Yeah.
and that's while I was testifying in front of, for this coerced bill debt and no, law, coerced debt bill. That's what I'm looking for.
Right.
Is that where you want me to restart? Yeah, I think I'll restart that. So,
Yeah.
so I was still being sued by the credit card company while I was at the same time testifying publicly and being written up in local newspapers, et cetera, for this coerced debt bill. And I let them know that
Yeah.
this was going on. And so I haven't bounced back. Obviously, it's, a week ago credit.
Ongoing.
Yeah, it's ongoing. And so that's why was in a position, I think, to kind of advocate more.
Yeah.
During COVID, I got a master's of law in elder law and estate planning. It's like, how do you protect your future? And how do you make sure this doesn't happen to you or to your kids? And you say who's most vulnerable is I wouldn't have guessed I ever would have been vulnerable to something like that.
Well, and we say it all the time, as much as most individuals understand how important it is to have a plan, an estate plan, and the wills and all the documents, there's still so many individuals out there that just never seem to be able to find the time to get it done.
Correct.
So, what advice can you give someone that might be worried they're in a similar situation, or they unfortunately found themselves in one?
I think one of the things, if possible, and this is true for finances across the board, to the extent you can be proactive. I mean, easy to say now,
Yep.
right? And I don't want to discount for the people that I thought I was proactive. I was asking for that folder for years, right? But to the extent you can, they say check your credit reports. Well, I didn't need to check my credit report because my credit report was fine and I wasn't in charge of our credit.
Finances.
I wasn't in charge of the finances. There were no problems. So I didn't check it. Well, check it frequently and often, right? Don't wait for your 20-year-old son who just found out that there's such a thing as a credit report to say, go check your credit report. So I think proactively, I think that's one way. But coerced debt can also happen in you can be checking it all day long. It doesn't have to be based on a credit score. Anytime that you have any kind of intimate partner violence or financial abuse, and that's where the overlap is, you could find yourself in a position that you have no choice. I mean, they could be sitting next to you. And actually, that was the defense my ex used in court was, oh, she couldn't figure it out. So I sat next to her and opened them for her, which if anyone believed that, but, it's amazing what they, and people who lie for their lives and it easily flows. So there are people, and that's where the coerced debt can also come into play. And then what you need to do is reach out to, I mean, hopefully these laws will start to help for the,
I certainly hope so.
yeah, that, the steps that they are requiring the banks to take in terms of the time period. Hopefully they're going to start holding accountable the perpetrators of the coerced debt. And that was the most frustrating thing for me is when I finally got released, which I was thankful for. I mean, took years, obviously. They never went and got the money from him.
He just disappeared and is living
Yep.
his life.
And he actually still has credit cards, I believe, at many of these banks.
They
Even
never
though
shut him down.
nope, they did not shut him down because they were making money. He had his accounts and so that was quite frustrating. So there's a lot of resources online. I know through searches, you can find a lot of private groups. There's like Connecticut Protective Moms in Connecticut. Some of it's applicable, some of it's not, whether you have custody, no custody, but there's such overlap and even internationally. And people have a lot of advice, and you can only really come up with the advice if you've lived through it because the system doesn't work the way you think it does or should. And there's another organization that contact of mine just started called Rock the Walls.
Okay.
Org, and she is trying to compile for all 50 states. She started with Connecticut and I believe New York, and it's we'll have sections on where to go for financial abuse, where to go, which would involve the coerced debt, where to go for
Wow.
physical abuse. And so that is, I think, up and running as of about 2 months ago.
Okay. That's
And
great.
so there are resources. There are the domestic violence or abuse shelters, but I don't believe for the most part they really knew what to do with the economics abuse at all. Oh, you can be safe if you stay here forever, right? Like with what, I money, like how can you get started? But I think there's a lot you can get. And they're like, oh, you can get a credit card for $1,000 with $1,000. You pay $1,000 and you work off of that and your credit score will go up. Maybe 10 years from now, up enough to, so some of it, so it's really kind of reaching out. And as I said, I'm not an internet, I don't tend to spend my days on chat boards, I guess is the best way to put it. But there is a lot out there. And more importantly, and I have to admit, I post rarely.
Okay.
Okay. I'm still very nervous. I'm out there. I mean, I write an article in the paper. I'll go in front of the legislature. I'll speak in it all. It's on the records everywhere. But there is a fear a little bit sometimes online. Is this safe? But you can read and get a lot of information and you can ask people to private message you. And I've done that.
Okay.
And I've replied to people that maybe I won't write online and answer and say, send me a message. And then if it's, you go through it a little bit. So there's National Safe Parent Organization if you're have your, worried about your kids as it affects them, because it's everybody.
Affects everybody. Yeah.
It does. And
I
it's hard moving forward. I'm not done. I need to, Connecticut just started. I think, as I said, we do need to have a way that this goes after the perpetrators of the crime, not just allowing the
oh man,
victims
yeah.
to be let off the hook. And until that happens, they're not at risk. It's terrible to say there's no disincentive. There's no disincentive to forcing,
Right.
your spouse or your parent to take out debt because it's not going to come back on you. If you were a business partner, in a heartbeat, you'd be arrested and sent to jail if you did this. If you were a complete stranger from a country in Africa or Russia that's taking out, yeah, you get caught, you get shut down, or you don't get, but your victim is cleared. There are rules that clear your victim, but not in family situations. And I think that that's where there's more room for improvement.
Absolutely.
And that's, I think, once again, in 2021, that's where Texas was actually on the cutting edge of this stuff. Which, I would like Connecticut to be better at this than Texas.
Yeah,
Nothing
I
but
agree. And is there anything we can do on a local basis with local legislation?
well, I think so. I think they are worried about their votes at a local level.
Right.
Okay. And the opposition to any of these bills were people that were so secure. And by the way, I have to say, there were very few people, but it only takes two people to filibuster or stymie an entire bill from getting passed. So that was a little bit of a political education for me that I didn't learn in my undergrad poli sci course. So, but getting out there, I mean, obviously helping other women and educating them. And I don't want to say it never happens to a man, but generally speaking, the statistics show it does not, or that it's very rare,
Rare.
but it is very rare. And I think by expressing your viewpoints, expressing your displeasure, one of the representatives that gave the hardest time to this Bill, who will remain unnamed, also took credit for it on his webpage when it passed for being very active in supporting domestic abuse legislation. And he did everything in his power. So he had one other partner in crime, so to speak. So
Okay.
just making it very clear, be aware what the reps are voting for in your area, talk to them,
Okay.
go to your town managers or your mayors. I've met with everybody. And, it's hard to keep it all the balls in the air all the time. So you start some things that don't end up
Sure. Sure.
following, coming to fruition the first time, and you'll have to pick it back up. But so that there are supports for the elderly
Yeah.
in someone should be able to sit there and help them and look at their finances, a volunteer,
Right.
right? Not just the child, the
And
adult.
it's great to have so many local organizations that are continuing to grow. And
Yeah, I mean, it's really, there are very active, wonderful people out there that have, the number of people who have lived similar situations or completely different situations, but they all kind of come together to help each other. And numbers matter.
absolutely.
And numbers matter, and showing up matters. And it doesn't happen by quietly just reading other people's chat boards. So I guess, as make noise, as someone who doesn't like to be the squeaky wheel.
I know you
I guess
don't.
that's kind of where it comes to. You have to, if you have the ability to make noise and it's safe to make noise,
Yeah.
then you need to.
Well, Karen, thank you for making a lot of noise. And
No, thank you, as I said, for bringing attention to it and for your book and efforts starting when, they're younger. This is nothing that premarital religious counseling of any religion covers.
yeah.
So these are the conversations that need to start about money and uh, keeping power.
And just continue to talk about it and not be silent about it.
I
So,
think that's true. So thank you so much. I appreciate it.
no, thank you, Karen, and good luck as you